All right. All right. Well, many of the ideas I'll be sharing with you this morning are taken from my book, Unleash Your Inner Company. The book is primarily a step-by-step guide for discovering, launching, and scaling the ideal business for you, starting with unsatisfied customer needs in areas you're passionate about. But the book also contains advice for policymakers, and that's the part I'll be talking about today. Part of the book I expanded into a paper for the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Small Business. I also have some copies of that. You can find it online at that URL. And this talk is taken directly from that paper. So, for the last 39 years, I've been privileged to work and live here in Silicon Valley. I've worked for large and small companies alike, founded or co-founded 3 of my own, and invested in many others. Some of these have succeeded, some of them have failed. So I've had very broad and deep involvement here for almost 4 decades. So how can we replicate Silicon Valleys around the world? Well, Silicon Valley spans a distance of about 50 miles from San Jose to San Francisco. Since about 2000, it's expanded from the San Francisco Peninsula to include the South of Market region of San Francisco. Here's a close-up view of San Francisco and the South of Market area and some of the familiar names you'll find here. Of course, these are just the giants. Among these are tens of thousands of smaller companies. Total employment in the region is about 3.5 million, of whom about 500,000 work in technology. 39 of the Fortune 1000 are headquartered here. Most people mark the founding of Silicon Valley from either Shockley Semiconductor in 1955 or when Hewlett Packard was founded in 1938. But it was actually a vibrant electronics industry as early as the 19-teens. Stanford was helping the Federal Telegraph Corporation get off the ground a full 30 years before Fred Terman at Stanford helped HP get off the ground. Stanford provided the first talent. The first company spun out of another company as early as 1910. The U.S. military has provided a role. It has provided boosts, particularly around World War I and World War II, but it's also provided volatility because its demand has typically gone away as soon as a war has been over. The culture of Silicon Valley in these early days was very similar to what it is today. Informal, collaborative, and a common enemy in the formal top-down bureaucratic companies of the East Coast, for example, RCA, which tried to control Silicon Valley startups here with its patent portfolio. The definitive guide to Silicon Valley, which I strongly recommend, is Tim Sturgeon's How Silicon Valley Came to Be. And non-competes have been part of our growth over the decades, and they've been part of the law here since 1941. No one could have predicted that semiconductors would give rise to mini-computers, software, PCs, biotech, and so forth. Silicon Valley has indeed grown and evolved without design or plan for over a century. It's a beautiful example of a complex adaptive system. Like a forest or a jungle or the human brain, no one planned it or designed it. It evolved. Order arises not by top-down design, but by the tens of thousands of individuals and companies self-organizing for mutual benefit. Such systems are unpredictable. Arbitrarily small differences can give rise to big differences in outcomes. They're dynamic, never at equilibrium, despite what they taught us in Econ 101. And finally, if you try to control them from the top down, you get unintended and generally undesirable consequences. So, in summary, as we've seen companies spin out from each other, organize, and compete with each other, forming complex ecosystems. For every success, there are many, many failures. We hear a lot more about the successes than the failures. But this means that many experiments are going on in parallel, and that maximizes learning. The aggregate knowledge of the individuals far exceeds that of any decision maker or even small group of decision makers. There are many more small to medium successes than there are unicorns, many more liquidity events in the $10 to $100 million range than there are in the billion-dollar plus range. These successes, large and small, drive regional economic growth and distribute wealth very broadly. Finally, neither the winning companies nor even the industries can be predicted. Even most venture capitalists fail. So let's not deceive ourselves into thinking we can predict them. A typical venture capitalist gets 1 or 2 companies out of 10 right. So let me suggest 3 sets of performance metrics that a region, if I go over this one. Hello. Yep. Do you want to just go ahead and advance it for me? Thank you. So here are 3 sets of performance metrics, a simple model for how any society, startup or otherwise, can think about, measure, and manage its entrepreneurial attractiveness and effectiveness. Here we have the attractiveness of the economic environment for entrepreneurship, driving the net flow of entrepreneurs into or out of the region, and both of those driving the long-term economic growth and standards of living of the region. In this talk, I'll focus on these first 2. My second talk, early this afternoon, I'll discuss how both of these, and specifically what forms of law and regulation, correlate with long-term economic growth. Next slide, please. Can I do it? There it is. So this is the performance metric number 1. It focuses on ends, how many entrepreneurs are being created in or are attracted to the region. The second one I'll talk about deals with means, which is creating a climate that's conducive to entrepreneurship. So here it's simply the number who've entered the region minus the number who have left the region, to compare regions to each other. Next, if you could click it, please. Hello. To compare region to region, we normalize by dividing by the population of the region or by the number of entrepreneurs in the region. So this is actually a family of metrics. Different versions give you different perspectives. There are different regions, countries, and provinces from which you're measuring, and there are different regions, countries, and provinces that entrepreneurs move from or to. So let's take a look at one example, Poland. Here we go. So it's simply the number who enter Poland minus the number who leave Poland divided by the number who stay in Poland for some number of years, say 5 years. So this metric ranges from at most +1 to -1. Well, here are some thoughts about this. My guess is that this overall metric for Poland is negative. I recently invested in Fido Labs, a natural language processing company in Gdansk that moved its headquarters to Silicon Valley and reincorporated in Delaware. So that would be one example of an entrepreneur and startup who has left Poland. So here's something to think about. What would it take to move Poland into the positive territory? How could we get entrepreneurs in Europe or in the United States thinking and saying, where we really want to be is in Poland? How could the tax, regulatory, and legal environment in Poland become so attractive that U.S. investors wouldn't care whether a company was in Poland or in the U.S.? Might startups in Poland be governed by Delaware law, for example? I don't know, but I think it should be explored. So that's an example of Poland. Next, please. Okay, so probably that metric is negative. Now, how is Silicon Valley itself doing on this metric? Well, not as well as you might think. Yes, Silicon Valley is growing, and given its size and strength, it'll continue to grow, although that growth has been slowing. Other technology regions in the U.S. are now growing faster. Next, please. So let's take a look at the top 10 U.S. state-to-state migration flows. The largest one is from New York to Florida as baby boomers retire, but the second largest one is from California to Texas. And in fact, of the top 10 state-to-state to migration flows, 4 of them are out of California. Only number 10, the smallest of these top 10, is into California. Let's take a closer look specifically at Silicon Valley. Next slide, please. Here are just Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, which are a big part of Silicon Valley. And this chart looks at foreign and domestic migration. The chart shows net migration along the top. It's fairly constant from foreign migration. The one that bounces around on the bottom, the lighter color, is domestic migration. You can see that's mostly out of Silicon Valley. And historically, when there have been net outflows, it's because there's been a weak economy or a downturn, for example, after the bust of 2000, 2001, and again after 2008. But what we're seeing right now is different. For the last 4 or 5 years, we're seeing a net outflow, or a trend towards a net outflow, and net outflow for the last 3 years of domestically from this region, even with a strong economy. So I think that gives us some thoughts about California. Next slide, please. Where are they going to? Well, here's migration from California. You can see the top destination is indeed Texas. And within Texas, it tends to be these 4 cities. These are cities in Texas are 4 of the major metropolitan areas in the U.S. that have experienced the largest recent change in population: Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. So on my metric number 1, Texas scores much higher than Silicon Valley does. Next slide, please. So what makes Texas so much more attractive to more Californians? Well, first of all, there's no state income tax. Texas is only one of 7 states without a tax, whereas California has one of the highest state income taxes. By one study, Texas has the 4th most favorable state tax environment, while California has the 45th. It has a friendlier regulatory environment. Energy is cheaper, labor is cheaper, you have more control over your property. There's a lower cost of living. Oops, we skipped ahead too far. There's a lower cost of living with median home prices considerably lower thanks to urban planning and regulation here in California. So given all of these factors, quite possibly, the title of this talk, next slide please, should be not how to create a Silicon Valley throughout the world, but how to create Texases throughout the world. So let's look at the next set of performance metrics, which focus more on means than ends. Next slide, please. And for here, I'll look at first a global set and then a set within the U.S. The global set are the World Bank Ease of Doing Business indices. And every year the World Bank ranks 190 different countries and regions from easiest to hardest to do business there, covering such metrics as how easy is it to start a business, deal with construction permits, get electricity, register property, and so forth. Well, here we can see that the United States ranks 8th on that list. If we go to the next slide, we can see the detailed performance metrics here, and we can see that sadly the United States has slipped from 7 to 8 in the last year. Here is a very ambitious but achievable goal for any country or region on this list. No matter what your current rank is, cut that rank in half in the next 5 years. If you're currently at 8, as the United States is, make it a goal to be at 4 by 2022. If you're currently at 50, make it a goal, or 24 as Poland is, make it a goal to be 12, and so forth. This will benefit everybody in the region, not just the entrepreneurs. Next, please. Now, let's focus within the United States. There's a similar ranking for the 50 U.S. states by Cato. It's called the Freedom in the 50 State Rankings, and we can see our Texas, next please, next, click it once, yep, ranks 28th out of the 50, not as well as we might have thought. And what's number one? Well, number one is New Hampshire. So why is New Hampshire ranked so highly? Well, I spoke to Matt Phillips, president of Free State Project in New Hampshire. Does anyone know Matt? Some of us here probably do. Great. Okay, well, as he points out, there have just been a ton of initiatives to improve economic and personal freedom in New Hampshire in recent years. Effective January 1 of last year, business taxes were cut by 3.5% to 4%. As a result of that, for the first 6 months of 2016, tax revenue actually increased by 16.5%, and employment is rising at a faster pace, 2,000 workers per month faster than before the cuts. Further tax cuts are slated for the first of next year, about 3.5%. In addition to that, next slide, please. There have been a number of improvements in regulatory freedom, such as the ones listed here. Brew pubs are allowed to make cider. Hair braiding has been removed from occupational licensing and so forth. In addition to these economic freedoms, thank you, next slide, please, are these improvements in personal freedoms in New Hampshire, and it's hard to say to what extent these improve or affect the economic climate in New Hampshire, but I'm sure they don't do any harm. Next slide. So maybe the title of this talk should really be not how to create a Silicon Valley or a Texas, but a New Hampshire around the world. Next, please. Well, both of these, next slide, please. Both of these sets of both of these metrics, the net flow of entrepreneurs into or out of your region and your ranking on the ease of doing business indices, is in marked contrast of what usually passes for promoting entrepreneurship today. These include all of the activities here, government grants to selected startups, short-term tax incentives, elevator pitches, in Europe, free trips to Brussels. These activities are seductive. I've been part of all of them, either as a judge or an advisor. But I also know that this is not where the real work lies. I call this entrepreneurship theater because it makes us look good and feel good. But the benefits are primarily short-term and cosmetic. Not only is it impossible to choose winning companies and industries, but when governments make the selection, political considerations very commonly intrude public choice concerns. I could give plenty of examples like Solyndra, a Solar Valley, solar energy company here, which received over $500 million of taxpayers' money from the U.S. Department of State in the state of California before declaring bankruptcy in 2011, none of which was ever recovered. So don't expose your own taxpayers in your startup societies to this. So instead, next slide, please. This is my last slide. What can we do? Well, aim for the lowest tax rates in the U.S. or the world, the lowest, lightest regulation in the U.S. and the world. You're competing for entrepreneurs not just within the 50 states, but worldwide. And the most government administration in the world. Don't try to pick and reward winners. We've seen that we have ecosystems and it's impossible to predict what company will be the key linchpin, the next key linchpin for that ecosystem to thrive and grow. So instead, create attractive environments and climates for all entrepreneurs and industries and adopt and promote a long-term view. In summary, last slide, please. To create Silicon Valley's, use metrics, focus on creating the most attractive tax and regulatory environments in the EU and the world, and empower and trust in individual startups and businesses to self-organize, grow, and flourish. Thank you very much.